there's a statue of the Buddha that has the mouth has a little turned up smile at the corner of the lips. And it's called the Buddha with the smile of unbearable compassion. The smile of unbearable compassion. Sounds like a contradiction in terms. What does he know that we could reflect about? Because most of us, when we come to suffering, when we face suffering, if we can, the first thing is we have to react immediately. Because we have to change it. That's the first natural, spontaneous reaction, and fed by our psychological ego. Because the recognition of suffering is a threat to the stability of the ego. So that when you look at it, you want to either push it away, which is all of the defense mechanisms, all of the denial, which you rationalize it. Like you can push it away by going up in levels of consciousness. You can go up to the plane where you're looking out and you see it all as karma. Somebody falls down in front of you and you say, karma. And you say of that child, karma. And that's really pushing it away. You can feel it. You can feel the coldness of it. And you can feel how cut off a person who would say that must be when they use the spiritual label in order to push away the pain of the situation. And another one we all use is pity, which is a way of pushing people away too. Oh, isn't that terrible? Which is it's a certain distance that you put between you and the suffering and another person. Pity. Sort of, I'm glad it's not me. And of course, denial and so on. And one of the things is, since it is the heart that reacts so first, initially, and the human heart's what's having the commerce with the suffering, the general thing is the heart just closes. You just freeze. You just go dead. You go cold. You go icy. You don't know what to do because you feel impotent to do anything in the face of immense suffering. And you develop not only spiritual up-level intellectual defenses, but you develop just other intellectual defenses like cynicism, which is a way of getting into your intellect and pushing and putting distance between you and that which is threatening to you. The other strategy for people that experience suffering is move towards it to change it. I got to do something about it. And a lot of you are feeling, I got to do something about things because there's so much pain and suffering. But since no matter what you do, there's going to be more, you can never do enough. You will never have the satisfaction of having eliminated suffering, which we'll see why in a moment. So that as long as you are at all attached to getting rid of the suffering before you can stop doing, you will just do and do and do and do. And if you don't watch out, your identification with being the doer will finally burn you out. You'll just get exhausted from trying so hard. And you will get frustrated, and frustration leads to aggression, so you'll end up being angry at yourself and at the whole system. And you get depressed. And so what are you contributing then? Now, if you can hear the edge of it, any reaction you have to the suffering in which you're identified with the reactivity is reinforcing the plane of reality in which suffering is real. Let me come at that much slower. I just wanted to say it out front before I forget it. Now, the Buddha said that at night, in the early watches of the night, the Buddha would look out over the entire Buddha fields and see all the suffering. And then he'd see who was ready, whose veil was very thin, who was ready to awaken out of the illusion that creates the suffering. And anybody that has done sadhana of any kind, spiritual practice, realizes that what ultimately has to be done is that you have got to break in between the perception of the suffering and the reaction to the suffering and bring into it some mindfulness. So that the first thing you do is start to break in there by just sitting with the suffering. Not do anything about it, just sit with it first. Until you can be with suffering. Until you don't have to push it away so hard. I've had many LSD trips and other psychedelic chemicals in which I've sat with suffering, not just my own, in which all my musculature and everything is aching and racked with pain, my jaw's gritted, all of that, but just looking with like eyes, those kind of hollow eyes, feeling that you see in people in prison of war camps or things like that. That look of just looking at what is and looking at suffering and just visions of suffering going before your eyes. And I think of people that didn't ask for this getting this in an LSD trip, and it's what's called a bad trip. From my point of view, it is opening to what is, and that's part of what meditation is about, is opening to what is. Not pushing and pulling, just being with it. And one of the big leaps is when you are ready to stop reacting so fast in order to be with it, to hear the whole nature of things, to hear how it all is about suffering. And what is required is that because your heart is closing down as the reaction, as you sit with it for a while and you just start to be able to look at it, your heart starts to open in the presence of it. And you have your heart open in hell is really what is being required of you. I have, with Stephen Levine and others, have had dying retreats. And in these retreats, very often for the first few days, it's very cathartic. It's just bringing out all the kind of emotional pain and fear people have about death. And then very often we show films. We've been showing films. We'll show a film like Red Asphalt, which is a film put out by the California State Highway Patrol to show to drunk drivers about what happens on the highway. And it's heads sticking through windows and decapitated and smashed bodies. And it's police photography. It's not cleaning up the act. And people look at it and they immediately react. It's, turn away, steel themselves, and we look at it. And then we start a meditation, bringing the awareness to the breath. Just be with what is. Hear the rain outside, see the lights, see my body up here. Just be with what is. And then when we've got somebody being with what is quietly, we run the film again, silently, with a meditative soundtrack. Just be with what is. Because part of the secret of compassion is being able to embrace darkness into light. It's being able to embrace suffering into yourself. It's being able to acknowledge and allow. And then the impeccable warrior hears what to do about it. But the first step is slowing down, and when you're too righteous, you can't even slow down. How can I even consider allowing this. I've got to do something about it. Can you hear that little place in there? It's a very interesting one. It's really the one that the social action groups are having to deal with right now in terms of their own growth. When the Buddhist sat and looked at the nature of suffering, he came back and he got up from under the Bodhi tree and he drifted away and he ended up at the deer park in Sarnath in India. And there he met 5 other yogis who used to be on the yogi circuit with him. And they were all ascetics, and they said, let's ignore Gautama because he broke, he didn't follow the traditions anymore. Let's not have anything to do with him. But he was so radiant that it was really hard for them to ignore him. I mean, light was pouring out of him. It's called Tej, it comes out of your head. So they finally said, what's up, Gautama? And he said, you want to hear? And they sort of were going to begrudgingly listen. So they sat down and he delivered his first sermon in the deer park at Sarnath. And his first sermon consisted simply of the 4 Noble Truths, which have come to be called the 4 Noble Truths by Buddhists, not by Christians. And the first noble truth is there is suffering. And in fact, if you explore that, you will see that suffering is inherent in form, because all form is limit, and limit is not unlimited, and there is suffering just at the edge. And suffering is in not getting what you want. Suffering is even in getting what you want because you're in form, and form is in time, and everything changes. So it means you're going to lose it anyway. So there's suffering even in winning. You lose. So he said there's a lot of suffering. Second noble truth, he said, pointed to, is that the cause that an individual suffers, that awareness suffers, is because it clings to something. It's called the clinging of the mind. Second noble truth. Third noble truth seems to follow rather obviously. You let go of the clinging, you end suffering. And the fourth noble truth was his eightfold path, his method for letting go of clinging. Sequence is very obvious. There is suffering. The cause of suffering is the clinging of mind. Like, you take the most extreme examples. Take somebody starving to death. Well, many of you saw the movie Gandhi, and Gandhi was starving to death, but was he busy starving to death? His mind wasn't clinging to the body that was starving to death. When you say, hello, who are you? Well, I'm starving to death. I mean, that isn't the way Gandhi would have put it. So there you have one of the most extreme example. One of the eightfold path is right understanding, and right understanding has 3 components to it. Dukkha, which is suffering, meaning understand the nature of suffering. Anicca, meaning impermanence, meaning everything's changing all the time. And anatta, meaning that there is nobody there. And that understanding frees you from suffering. It's as simple as this. As long as you think you're somebody, you're going to suffer. Somebody suffers. And nobody doesn't suffer. But somebody suffers. The question is, what is it like to be nobody? Would you do anything as nobody? Don't you need to be somebody to do something? When you took birth, See, you notice how I said it, when you took birth. I didn't say when you were born. When you took birth. See, I always have this funny situation when I'm lecturing night after night. Who am I talking to? Which level of reality are we meeting in? Are we at Omega, in New York State on Tuesday? Is that the reality you and I are meeting in? Hi, Omega-ites. Is that it? Are you women and men? Is that it? And part of what awakening, spiritual awakening is, or awakening of consciousness, is doing what Einstein did to Newtonian physics, doing it to the social, psychological, phenomenological universe. That is, seeing the relative reality of all of the places we stand rather than their absolute reality. And then you understand the meaning of the term, there is nowhere to stand. Because if you're standing in astral, you're looking up at the one and you're looking down at the personality and the body. You're pushing, these are all not me. If you're just your body, you're not your personality, you're not, etc. And as long as you deny any part of yourself, you're shortchanging yourself. Now can you see that those first three planes, in fact the fourth plane too, the one of soul, now bringing in anatta, the one of soul as well, all four of those first four channels, all have form. They are all something. They're all in time and space. Although the time of souls is kalpas and yugas. And you remember Buddha's second noble truth. The cause of suffering is clinging. Clinging to what? Clinging to form, clinging with the mind, clinging to anything, any identity, any sense of who you are, any answer, who are you, any one you give that you believe is real in the sense of absolutely real. Therein lies suffering. First, because it all changes all the time, and it will go away. I am Ozymandias, look on my works, ye mighty in despair. Nothing more remains. There's another component worthy of notice. That those planes at which there is form, that all form functions lawfully. Everything in time and space functions lawfully. We may not understand the laws with our intellect, but we have a sense of the lawful nature of things. And everywhere we dig deep enough, we see law. If you go into biogenetics, if you go into astronomy, if you go into astrology, if you go into the I Ching, the Kabbalah, the Quran, the Talmud, if you go into music, if you go into psychology, if you go into history, wherever you go, politics, you see law. You see things are lawfully related one to another. You see the law of the Tao, the natural law. It's not necessarily the law of the logic, the laws that fall within logic. But it is related to each other in some kind of systematic fashion. Now, you can see the predicament that if you are identified with anything that is in form, you are therefore an unfolding lawful event. I mean, I am in a 1931 model, body. It is decaying according to the laws of decay. If I am this body, I would be freaking. If you identify with any form, you are experiencing in some level of your emotional makeup being a victim of circumstance. It's as if you're in the presence of forces that are so vast, and you are just this little thing being pushed and shoved and pulled, and you're dying before you even got a chance to live, and you can't get out from under your neurosis. But there is a line from Galatians 5:18. It says, if you are led of the Spirit, you are not under the law. If you are led of the Spirit, you are not under the law. It means that when you get up into those higher channels, there is part of who you are that is equally as real as all the rest of it that is not in form. But how are you going to conceive of it? Because any conception you have of it is form, is reductionistic. You see your predicament? Your thinking mind cannot acknowledge within itself who you are. Or put it another way, you aren't who you thought you were. Or you aren't who you think you are. You exist behind form. Now, form, for things to come into form in the beginning, you start with yin and yang and yub and yum and positive and negative and dark and light and all the polarities. Good and evil, for example. That's an interesting one. We're talking now about being behind form, meaning there is a part of your being that has nothing to do with good and evil. And this turns out to be quite scary to people, to realize that they are outside the law. And to realize that you are beyond all of the conventional curbs and motives and fears and hopes and desires. It's very, very scary. This is what the journey, the spiritual journey, has inherent within it, is facing a lot of this fear of not being able to have the security of the 10 Commandments up there, and if you do bad, somebody's going to knock you dead. Either the 10 Commandments and the Yama and the Shila and all the different purification criteria of each method, of each program, have to have a validity that comes as you look into form from the formless, or forget them. And when you're standing behind, now if I look at you, and I realize the absurdity of saying, if I look at you, and you are also behind form, what is this? What is this? What is this? It's like that story of the man rowing his rowboat in the fog in China. Very thick fog, and he hits another boat. And he starts to scream, "You fool, why weren't you looking where you're going?" And the other boat comes alongside and he sees there's nobody in it. As long as you invest in a reality with attachment, not involvement. I'm not talking about being involved in realities. I'm talking about being attached to reality, meaning identifying with it, meaning thinking it's you. And thinking that plane of reality is absolutely real. As long as you do that, there is no way that you can release you and everybody else from suffering in an absolute sense. When I walk into the room with somebody who is, quote, dying, the question is, do I see, quote, somebody who is dying? Or do I see a fellow soul who happens to be in a body which is dying? The soul is about to drop this body. Or do I see this all as the whimsy, the play of God? Or do I see it all as form that is nothing other than formlessness? It is the form of formlessness. Where I am perceptually standing determines what will come out of me, and what comes out of me will determine whether or not my presence liberates that other person or not, or could liberate them if they were ready to be liberated. Because you don't liberate another person, you merely create an environment in which they get free if they're ready. And you can see that if you identify with form in any way, even with your thoughts, you are the victim. You are a part of an unfolding law. You experience it happening to you. And yet there is a part of you that isn't in form, and that part, out of that part comes the creation of all the form. The form comes out of the formless. And at the part of you that is just what you might call lop, or spacious awareness, or is, pure mind, whatever you want to call it, that part of you, the Atman, that part of you is the creator. But you look, you and I, having grown up for the most part in Western religions, do you see what heresy, what chutzpah it is to say, I am the creator? I mean, you can get just so close in this I-thou business. You can be aware of it. Ugh. But you better not go that next step and merge with it. But that is the only part of your being which really is free to create. Only the part that is not in form is not in law, and only the part that is not in form and not in law is free, and only the part that is free can truly create. All the rest of it is merely lawfully unfolding. The only way I can justify this business that I'm in of speaking to people like this as part of my role is I'm not an enlightened being. I am at some level, but I'm not fully consciously an enlightened being. But I'm sort of a mouth for a process that a lot of us are sharing. Some of us came into it at one moment, and some of us came into it at another moment, some in one way and some in another. But I really just say things, talk about changes that are going on that I think that most of you will find very familiar. Although you may have shortcut some of these, I might have done them the more circuitous and painful route. And what I did was I started to just list different things that I thought had changed in my perceptions over these years, and I thought I'd just share some of those with you, because I think they are as rich an inner statement, an inner history, as we could expect of ourselves in this period of time. When I tried to do the 10-year business, that was hard because the meaning of time has changed as one major thing. Some of you may have noticed that. A year ago, I was 50 years old, and I've always gone to motels on my birthday because I don't like sort of that kind of hysterical fun that people have on celebrations usually. Sometimes it's real, but often it isn't. But this time was my 50th birthday, and I really wanted to milk it and see if there was something in there to really enjoy. So I called all these people and I said it was my 50th birthday, and I had 4 parties. And we'd have cakes and I'd bring champagne, or they'd have champagne, and I did one on television in New York, and they had a big birthday cake. No matter how I milked it, I couldn't quite feel like I was any age. I mean, I have a 50-year-old body. This is a 1931 model. Right here. It's a foot decaying perfectly lawfully for a 31 model, just like I have a 74 MG. This is a 31 body. And so I was really celebrating the age of my vehicle at one level. Because I'd say that I'm at least 2 kalpas old on one plane. That's hundreds of thousands of years. Or else I'm newly born. Take your choice, because that's what it feels like. It feels like all and everything. I feel like every age. Years ago, I was very caught in specialness. I was what I now would call a phony holy. I was busy trying to be high for me and everybody else. I assumed that everybody wanted me to be high all the time. So I would prepare myself to be high in front of everybody. And there's a certain way you are when you're high. You know, you smile a lot and you're very benevolent, and a certain role, or the holy man role. And I took all the parts of me that didn't fit into that role, and I sort of shoved them under the rug so that I could be who everybody wanted me to be. Because I wanted to be that too. I really wanted to be Ram Dass. See, I had what was called vertical schizophrenia. I even had a name to go with each of my personalities. So there was Dick Alpert, and then there was Ram Dass. And Ram Dass would sit in front of a group of people and look out and just loved everybody and wanted nothing. And Dick Alpert was counting the house. And worse than that was that Dick Alpert was impersonating Ram Dass. Somebody would come up and say, "Oh, Ram Dass, thank you for your writings." And I'd hear Ram Dass say, I don't know who I was, but I would hear Ram Dass say, "Wouldn't you like to come up and see my holy pictures?" Well, that may seem funny to you, but it wasn't from inside, because what I felt was just a tremendous amount of hypocrisy in order to be what everybody wanted me to be. For those of you that are therapists, this just sounds like another case history, but that's... I once spoke at Einstein Medical School, Grand Rounds, medicals, you know, the hospital, Einstein Hospital, and in New York. The young Turk psychiatrist brought me there. And they would have, at Grand Rounds, they would have a lecture presentation, and they'd alternate it with a case study. And I came in early. Those were the days when I was wearing robes, which looked like a dress, and beads. And I came in and I sat only cross-legged, and all the chairs had narrow arms, so I sat on the end of the conference table. And these old Viennese psychiatrists started to come in. And they, of course, concluded that they had read the schedule wrong. So I presented him as a case. It took them a while to figure out the case was presenting itself. Well, you see, what had happened was that the spiritual identity played right into my hands psychologically. Because psychologically, there were whole parts of my being that I was afraid of and that I didn't accept. And here I had a justification for getting rid of them by becoming holy. And I was using my spiritual journey psychodynamically
in order to get myself free of things that I couldn't acknowledge in myself. But after a while, you begin to feel like you're standing on sand. You have to deal with the horror. You have to live with your own horror. And the predicament was that I was trying to live in the projections that other people were creating for me. But every now and then I had to be alone. And when I was alone, I'd go into very deep depressions, which I hid. And my theory was that if I did my sadhana hard enough, if I meditated deeply enough, if I opened my heart in devotional practices wide enough, sort of all that stuff would go away. But it didn't. And it has taken me a lot of years to be able to understand what the teaching was in all of this. I was busy going from the two into the one, from, you could say, dualism into non-dualism, from the multiplicity into the unity. All of yogic techniques are designed for that purpose. Yoga means union. And I could huff and puff in pranayama and control my breath to go into a trance state. And in that trance state, all of Dick Alpert just had gone completely. But I always came down again. And down had a pejorative connotation for me. I kept wanting to get high. I didn't want to come down. And as you know, I had years of attempting, along with my friend Ralph Metzner and Tim Leary and others, at better living through chemistry. But I indeed did keep coming down. And even with yogic techniques, I did. Now, in the course of the years, I've developed a lot of very strange friends. And one of them is a being named Emmanuel. And Emmanuel is interesting because Emmanuel doesn't have a body. He's a being on another plane, and he speaks through a woman named Pat Rodegast. And I know some of you here have a difficult time accepting my friend Emmanuel. I mean, you'd accept any of my other friends, but somehow you say you have no prejudices about color, sex, religion. But bodies, somehow, if somebody doesn't have a body, you immediately don't know that you want to accept them. But I figure that's your problem, because he's my friend, and the way I figure it is I'll take my teachings anywhere I can get them, okay? I don't care whether you got a body or which kind it is. If you got a teaching, I want it. And Emmanuel had a good teaching. Let me read you one of the things he said to me. He said, "You're here because you chose to be here, because this is a learning place. Each lifetime is a wonderful opportunity to expand your consciousness and to move closer, ever closer to your oneness with God. This happens in very small stages. First, oneness with self, oneness with your human community, then oneness with God. It cannot be done in one blinding flash. It would be too incomprehensible, too confusing. So be patient. When we choose to come back, we construct an embryo to hold within us the areas of distortion that we need to work on. Then we choose our infinite environment to act as a catalyst to bring out these areas. So you were where you needed to be as a very small child. So accept the distortions in you, because when you accept them, you can transform them. That's what life is about. You're here to find these areas of imperfection, to understand them, to love them, and to educate them into reality, which is truth, light, love. If in the transitional period you find things in yourself that are not perfect, don't blame yourself. Celebrate. So in effect, what Emmanuel said to me when I said to him, "Emmanuel, what work do I have to do now?" He said, "Ramdas, you're in a school. Why don't you try taking the curriculum?" He said, "You took a human birth. You're so busy being holy. Why don't you try being human?" Funny, I'd never thought of that. Isn't that far out? Because somehow being human was less than perfect. Even though I intellectually knew that form is no other than formless and formless is no other than form, and I knew that the manifestation was God made manifest. Everything was perfect out there except me. But original sin was going to have a last stronghold right here. So I said, okay, Emmanuel, here I go. I decided to just go and be human. Now, I'd already figured this out, really. I remember being drunk with Alan Watts in a Benedictine monastery one night, if you can handle that image. And Alan said, you know, the trouble with you, Dick, and you know you're going to get real truth at a moment like that. It's like 3 a.m. He says, you're too attached to emptiness. So with Alan and Emmanuel looking over my shoulder, I had already figured out that as long as I pushed anything in the universe away, I wasn't going to be free. And I saw that the game wasn't getting high, the game was being free. And that free included the highs and the lows. Free included it all and everything, as Gurdjieff said. Not, this is all God except that. You just can't get stuck in those places. It's not good enough. That lovely line of G. Manly Hall, he who knows not that the Prince of Darkness is but the other face of the King of Light, knows not me, says God. And if you're going to aim towards one, you can't get stuck along the way at two. Emmanuel said, if you want to be free, you're going to have to embrace original sin. You're going to have to incorporate the darkness into your light. Now, because I had sort of steeped myself in a Hindu tradition of renunciation, which could produce liberated beings, but more often produces horny celibates. I'm going to get in trouble at some level for this kind of stuff. I got to watch out. I found that when in so many years, I had pushed away so much part of my personality because I just kept denigrating the personality and saying, look, it's all, I called it body and fender repair work therapy. And I just had this feeling that somehow I looked and I said, in those days I said, look at all the great saints, they're all as neurotic as anybody else. It's just that it's kind of irrelevant. And so you don't have to change your neuroses, you just stop identifying with them. And you just make friends with them and they come by for tea. Because I realized, I mean, I'd been through years of psychoanalysis, and all I had done was, really, I just invested so much reality in my neurosis, there wasn't a chance they were going to go away. Because the analyst thought my neuroses were real, because his were real. So we just kept reinforcing the reality of our identities. How could I be other than a patient? He was a doctor. There's only room for 2 of us in the room. So I found myself having opened up to relationship, and I was like a post-pubescent. And see, some years when you're doing, what I do is I live very spirally. I spend time sort of ram-dassing around the world. And then the toxicities build up and build up and build up until I begin to think it's real. And then I take time off. And I go to a monastery in Thailand, or I go to Bali and swim, or I go to Florence, Italy and hang out with Michelangelo. Or I do different things each year. So I was having a relationship this year. And I found myself sitting in the bathtub crying with jealous rage. I couldn't believe it. I mean, I thought, this couldn't be me. I mean, My God, Ram Dass, what are you doing? How absurd. And there was this part of me that was giggling. And I was crying, and the pain was excruciating. You know what jealousy is. Somebody must know what jealousy is like. I mean, the pain's really... Now, there's a tricky point right here of what's happened with me, because, see if I can get this across. There's a thing called non-attachment, and then there's a psychodynamic called dissociation. And one often masquerades as the other, you see. So I was busy being non-attached. I'd say, there's depression. Ha, 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 ha. See? Now, that looked like non-attachment, but actually, you know that it was dissociation. And that was the first part. That was when I used to be phony about my personality. Then, when I started to open up to it, by the time I started to open up to it, I had developed something inside of me that was so deep and so rock-like, I guess. Although, yeah, rock-like. On the way, you develop a thing called the witness, like Ouspensky in Search of the Miraculous, describing becoming self-remembering. Ouspensky is walking down the street. Ouspensky is turning left. Ouspensky is and then Ouspensky saw his tobacconist, and he remembered he needed tobacco, and 2 days later he remembered he was doing the experiment. Oh, I need tobacco. That was the end of the experiment. That's witnessing, and you can do that up to a certain point, but then the witness is just another part of your ego, really. It's just part looking at the other part. And finally, you witness the witness, and that's a kind of a meditative technique you turn in on yourself. And then behind all that, there's just a place. You can't even call it a place. It's just like sky. It just develops this kind of a context, a frame of reference of isness. It doesn't have any quality to it. You can't say it's happy or sad or watchful, or it's not looking, but it's seeing. It just is. It's the Tao. It's the way. And there I was. What happened now when I was open to my personality stuff, really open to it with the full blast of it, I was no longer holding on to that space, but it was still there. It was there in a different way, though. It wasn't there to push away the pain. It was there along with the pain. Is that coming through? Can you hear what I'm talking about at all? Something that is still really coming out more clearly to me was that the movement from knowing the world through conceptual structures and knowing it another way, which we could use, the Western word we often use is intuitively. I have felt that the problems that we kept creating with our rational minds were only going to be solved by our intuitive connection to the universe. And I kept looking for intuitive training to connect with that deeper and deeper part of my being that just knows. It's not one that knows it knows. That's the frontal lobes. It just knows. It knows because it is. It is. It's like knowing how to make a fist. You don't know you know how to do it, but you do it. And when I was in that intuitive domain, everything in the universe is subject. When I'm in my analytic conceptual mind, the universe is object. I'm always one thought away from where the action is. So that I could see that my thinking mind was an instrument of it reinforced my sense of separateness. And that I didn't want to get rid of my thinking mind, but I wanted to have it around like, hey, you, I need you. Not, yes, I wanted to change the thinking mind from a master into a servant, so that I didn't have to think all the time, because I had always thought all the time, because I was paid for thinking all the time. So when I'd fly across the country in my airplane, I'd have a clipboard on my knee to write down important thoughts and a tape recorder to tape all my ideas, because that was my bread and butter. And it got very complicated for me, because as life gets as real as it is, it's very hard to rationally think through everything. It's awfully complicated. I had a dramatic example I've talked about in my lectures this year. A year ago, or a year and a half ago, I was in Benares in India, the city of dying. And a friend and I were going to the bathing ghats, to the sacred bathing area in the Ganges River, where you can bathe with all of the floating dead bodies and things. It's a very auspicious place to die, by the way, Benares. And as we were going there, we passed about, I don't know, I really don't know the number. I've changed the number at different times because I don't remember, but probably it was about 100, 125 lepers. And they all had begging bowls. And we shared our coins, my friend and I had about 20 coins, and there was 125 lepers. So I started down the line. Like, who am I going to give the coins to? Now my rational mind started in, well, let's see. That fellow is missing his arms, but that woman has her face eaten away. Do you suppose that's worth a rupee? I mean, can you hear how ghastly that is? Because I only had 20 coins and there were 125 lepers. And I did this for about 3 coins. I mean, if you're young and you don't have any feet, what's when you on a score of 1 to 10? Okay. I'm using a grotesque example, but life is pretty grotesque. I mean, you're on the good guy mailing list too, you know. Somebody is, I can hear her out there. Finally, I just gave up. I just went on intuitive. I just went down the line looking people in the eye, and every now and then I'd hand out a coin. And the coins were over, and I was enjoying being with all these beings, and I didn't get into the whole business of guilt and judgment and all this stuff, which would have just destroyed the moment for me. It turns out they have a union and they share all their coins. I didn't know that, so the lesson was great for me, you know. And so I have been sort of really opening to my intuitive way of doing things. So I just respond much more whimsically without any reason for doing it particularly. Sure, I'll do that. No, I won't do that. Why? I don't know. Well, shouldn't you? No. If you can stand that original confrontation, you mean you're not being rational? No. You gotta really, you know, have a cold eye at that moment. I mean, 'cause, you mean you trust, but don't you know what you're full of? Yeah, but behind that, I know. But do you know you know? No. And you still trust? Yes. I don't know. I mean, you recognize this dialogue. It's a dialogue you have with yourself, actually. And it gets extraordinarily exciting when you just say, well, here we go. I'm going intuition. But the problem that I ran into for some years was that the doorway to the intuition is through the human heart. And I was trying to leap into cosmic love without dealing with emotionality, because emotionality was a little too human for me. And what I experienced was that there was, see how I can say this, that I had used pushing away my humanity to embrace my divinity. And then I wanted to be intuitive, But the intuition, the impeccable warrior intuitive action has to come from a blending of humanity and divinity. And until I could accept my humanity fully, my intuitions weren't going to be fully in harmony with the way of things. The paradoxes that I was stretching to deal with is that when you get into one plane, you look out and you say, we are all one. But it's my television set. The resolution of it is the Sufi statement, trust in Allah, but tie your camel. When I went into my sixth chakra, everything looked absolutely perfect to me. I could look at anything. I could look at suffering and see the way in which it was grace. I could see death as grace. It was a place that was so clear, but with that clarity, there was no warmth. It was the kind of clarity that if somebody falls down in front of you, you say, karma. But when I'd come down into my human heart, it would hurt so bad. Because the more you open up to the suffering of the universe, the easiest way to handle it is to go up. It's much harder to stay down and stay open. It's excruciatingly painful. And I began to feel that what my freedom was going to lie in was the creative tension of being able to see simultaneously the perfection and also to experience the pain. To see that there was nothing to do and to work as hard as I could to relieve suffering. To see it was all a dream and still live within the reality of it. That creative tension. And I felt that the place that I had to work finally, and I have to work, and I am working, is to get the fullness of the human heart. And I begin to feel like a character in The Wizard of Oz that has a tin heart. Because I saw human beings getting so lost in their emotionality that I just kept going up in order to, and embracing the kind of clear, crisp perceptions of the universe. People said, we love you and we think you're beautiful and you're very clear, but at some level, people would say to me, we don't trust you. And I heard what they were saying. They were saying they didn't trust me because they couldn't feel my heart. They couldn't feel my humanness. There's an image of a Buddha statue with a tiny smile at the edge of the lips, and it's known as the smile of unbearable compassion. It's a way in which you can open to how it all is, the horrible beauty of it all, and you can bear it. Not by deadening yourself, but by balancing. And what I'm experiencing is that as the faith has gotten deeper, not the beliefs, because beliefs aren't going to keep you warm on a cold night. That's too head trippy. The faith, the connection to that which you are at the deepest level, to the universe, to the oneness of all things. As that faith gets deeper and deeper, so you can dramatically, much more freely throw yourself into life. As long as the faith flickers, you've got to be very tentative about the way you go into life because you're always afraid you're going to lose your connection to the Spirit. But when that faith is really strong, you can say, here I come, wow. And what I've experienced in the past few years, people come up and say, you know, Ramdas, you're really just human. But they're saying it with, it's an interesting thing what I had done psychodynamically. Because my personality felt so inadequate that what I was doing was becoming bigger than life. So everybody, what I did to everybody else was they'd sit down there and say, oh, look at Ramdas. We could never be like him. And now they look and they say, gee, he's just another guy. What do you know? And that freed other people. It was interesting that as I no longer wanted to play with that psychologically, the whole game of communication changed. It's a big one. It's a big one. It's a big one, embracing humanity. Not embracing humanity, embracing my humanity.